Welcome to Lesson 5 of Image Bearers. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. You know, every now and then you come across someone who forces you to see things in a different light, in a new and better way. Today's image bearer, through a television program that lasted the length of his career, did just that. Today we look into the life of the one and only Mr. Rogers. But before we get into his life, let's start with the game. If you can get a hold of an iconic Mr. Rogers sweater, what color would you wear? Personally, I'd go with a green. But we're not here to talk about sweaters all day. We're here to learn about how Mr. Rogers reveals more about who God is to us. So here are 3 qualities of Mr. Rogers that reflect the image of our Creator. Number 1, innovative. As you saw in the game, Mr. Rogers got into television because he didn't like the current programming that he saw on TV. But he saw promise in using this new type of media for children. He used many of the skills that he learned throughout his childhood to create what we now know as Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. From music and piano to puppetry and ventriloquism, Mr. Rogers created a sort of variety show for kids. Mr. Rogers is creative because he bears the image of our creative God. Look around you. Everything you see has been made at God's command and out of his own design. Jeremiah chapter 10 verse 12 proclaims that God made the earth by his power, and he founded the world by his wisdom and stretched out the heavens by his understanding. And just as Mr. Rogers created Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood out of who he was as a person, so too does God create because he is naturally creative. Romans chapter 1 verse 20 explains that since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. And at the pinnacle of God's creativity is humanity. Ephesians chapter 2 verse 10 declares that we are God's handiwork. And we have been created with the purpose and the intent of putting God's glory on display. You honor and worship God simply by being who you are. Number 2, compassionate. Mr. Rogers is quoted as saying, "Anyone who does anything to help a child in his life is a hero." And that became his mission in life. His compassion and love for children is what led Mr. Rogers to create Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and focus on the social and emotional well-being of kids. He dared to tackle such topics as civility, tolerance, sharing, self-worth, death, divorce, and much more in the show's 33-year run, preparing kids to face the complexities of this world. The compassion Mr. Rogers demonstrates is just a glimpse of the astounding compassion of our loving God, whose steadfast love never ceases and whose mercies have no ending, from Lamentations 3:22 and 23. In Matthew 9:36, as Jesus looks over a crowd of people, he is overcome with compassion, for the crowd was harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus became the good shepherd that they were in need of, healing the sick and teaching God's word and proclaiming the good news of God's kingdom. And who could forget the ultimate showing of compassion? Jesus' sacrificial death on the cross, making a way for all believers to gain entry into God's eternal kingdom. Our God is a God of unmatched compassion. Number 3, neighborly. I don't have much to say to have to prove this one to you. Aside from the show being called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, in the opening moments of every episode, Mr. Rogers sang these lyrics. I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Those lyrics just roll off the tongue, and what a beautiful invitation it is. To be a neighbor of Mr. Rogers is to be known, welcomed, and loved. Perhaps this invitation comes at just the right time as the world combats loneliness, isolation, fear, jealousy, hatred, and much, much more. What we all need is a good understanding of what it means to be neighborly. And while we can't all be Mr. Rogers' neighbors, we do have a God who can, and who invites us into his home for a big banquet. All are invited, regardless of even their past behavior, but you must accept the invitation. And you can do it today by putting your faith in Jesus and being baptized into his family. There is no greater joy than to be neighbors to God and to live in his eternal kingdom. So today's challenge is simply to accept the love of God into your life. What are you waiting for? What is holding you back? God always invites us to try him out, to taste and see that the Lord is good. And so I promise that if you taste and see, you will find that the Lord is good. I promise that you won't regret it.